Chapter 11, The Ancient Hebrews and the Origins of Judaism. Introduction. In Chapter 10, you learned about Egypt's southern neighbor, the African neighbors of Cush. In this chapter, you will learn about a group of people who lived northeast of Egypt, the Hebrews. The Hebrew civilization developed gradually after 1800 BCE and flourished until 70 CE. The people who became the Hebrews originally lived in Mesopotamia. Around 1950 BCE, they moved to the land of Canaan, modern-day Israel. The Hebrews were the founders of Judaism, one of the world's major religions. As you will learn in the next chapter, the Hebrews eventually became known as the Jews. Judaism is the Jewish religion. The origins of Judaism and its basic laws are recorded in its most sacred text, the Torah. The word Torah means God's teaching. The Torah consists of the first 5 books of the Jewish Bible. Christians refer to the Jewish Bible as the Old Testament. In this chapter, you will read about some of the early history of the Jewish people told in the Bible. You will meet 4 Hebrew leaders, Abraham, Moses, and King David and Solomon, and learn about their contributions to the development of Judaism. What we know about the ancient Hebrews. Historians rely on many artifacts to learn about the ancient Hebrews and their time, including the Torah. The Torah, historians use the Torah to understand the history of the Jewish people and the development of Judaism. As often happens in ancient times, this history was handed down orally from generation to generation. Later, it was written down. In addition to the Torah, historians look for a variety of other sources of information about early Jewish history. To help them understand the events and ideas of the time period, they examine archaeological artifacts as well as other written records. The early history of the Hebrews. According to the Torah, the ancestors of the Hebrews, a man named Abraham, lived near Ur in Mesopotamia. Around 1950 BCE, Abraham and his clan migrated to the land of Canaan. Settling in Canaan, the Hebrews herded flocks of sheep and goats. About 1800 BCE, many Hebrews moved to Egypt. According to the first book of the Torah, they fled Canaan because of a famine. For a time, they prospered in Egypt, but eventually they were made slaves. In time, one of their leaders, Moses, led the Hebrews in their escape from Egypt. For 40 years, says the Torah, the Hebrews wandered in the wilderness until they settled once again in Canaan. By 1000 BCE, the Hebrews had set up the kingdom of Israel in Canaan under King David and his son, King Solomon. David forged the Hebrew into one united nation. Solomon built a magnificent temple in the capital city of Jerusalem. Important Hebrew leaders. The Torah tells about events in the lives of early Jewish leaders. 4 key leaders were Abraham, Moses, David, and Solomon. Abraham is called the father of the Hebrews. One central idea of Judaism is the belief in a single God. According to the Torah, it was Abraham who introduced this belief to the Hebrews. This was a new idea in the ancient world, and at the time, most people worshiped many gods and goddesses. According to the Torah, God told Abraham to move his family from Mesopotamia to Canaan. God also promised Abraham that he would make him the father of a great nation and that he would bless this nation. Abraham did this as he was told, and his descendants became known as the Jewish people. The greatest leader of the Hebrews was Moses. The Torah tells us he led his people out of slavery in Egypt. Moses told the Hebrews and God would lead them to Canaan, the promised land, in exchange for their faithful obedience. Moses also gave Judaism its fundamental laws. The Torah tells how God gave Moses 10 important laws engraved on 2 stone tablets. These laws became the foundation of Judaism. After escaping from Egypt and wandering in the wilderness, the Hebrews came once more to Canaan. It was there that they created a united kingdom under King David and his son Solomon. King David established Jerusalem as a holy city. King Solomon built Jerusalem's first great temple. The city of Jerusalem and its temple became powerful symbols of the Hebrews and their faith in God. Let's learn more about each of the important leaders by looking at some of the history of the Jewish Bible. The life of Abraham, father of the Jews. The father of the Hebrews was a man named Abraham. Originally called Abram, he was born about 2000 BCE in the city of Ur in Mesopotamia. The people of Ur worshipped many gods, but Abram came to believe there was only one true God. The belief in one God would set Judaism apart from ancient religions, and Abram's special religion to God would become the foundation of the Hebrew faith. Abraham's covenant with God. According to the Torah, the faith that would become Judaism began with a sacred agreement or covenant between God and Abraham. The Torah said that God visited Abraham when he was an old man, and God told him, "Leave your own country and your father's house and go to a country that I will show you." God promised to make Abraham the father of a great nation of people. Abram obeyed. Around 1950 BCE, he gathered as many relatives and went west into the land of Canaan. When Abram was 99 years old, the Torah said, God spoke to him again, "I will make a covenant between myself and you." God promised to favor and protect Abraham's descendants, meaning his children, and the generations that would follow. In return, Abraham agreed that he and his people would always devote themselves to God. As a mark of their covenant, God gave Abram a new name, Abraham, which means father of many. God also promised the land of Canaan to Abraham's people. For Jews, Canaan became the promised land. According to the Torah, the covenant meant that Jews would set an example for how God wanted people to live. Abraham's sacrifice. According to the Torah, God tested Abraham's faith and obedience many times. The final test was the hardest. It was common at that time to offer animals as a sacrifice to God. An animal such as sheep would be killed and then burned on an altar. In his old age, Abraham had finally fathered a son, Isaac. The Torah said that one day God tested Abraham by telling him to make a sacrifice of his son. Abraham dearly loved his son, yet his devotion to God was so complete that he brought Isaac to a mountain to be sacrificed. At the last minute, God sent an angel to stop Abraham from killing his son. Abraham had promised his faith and obedience, and God renewed the promise to him. God said, "I will make your descendants as many as stars in the heaven." According to the Torah, God kept the promise. The Hebrews flourished. The nation was made up of 12 tribes that were descendants from Abraham's grandson, Jacob, whom an angel from God had named Israel. Abraham made his many contributions to the development of Judaism. He was the ancestor of the Jewish people. He introduced the belief in a single God, and because of his covenant with God, Jews believed they should set an example of how to live. Their rewards were the promised land. These beliefs became a central part of Judaism. The greatest test of the Hebrews was the greatest leader of the Hebrews was the prophet Moses. The Torah tells the story of how Moses led the Hebrews out of slavery in Egypt and gave them God's laws to live by. By the time of Moses, around 1250 BCE, a large group of Abraham's descendants were living in Egypt. There, the Torah said, the Hebrews increased in number and became very powerful. Fearful of their growing strength, the Pharaoh turned them into slaves. But God heard the cries of the enslaved Jews. According to the Torah, God told Moses, "I will send you to the Pharaoh, and you shall free my people." Moses went before the Pharaoh and told him to let the Hebrews go. And when the Pharaoh refused, God punished Egypt with 10 terrible plagues. In one plague, insects called locusts devoured the crop. In another, the waters of the Nile turned to blood. And finally, God sent an angel to kill the firstborn son in every Egyptian family. Weeping over his own dead son, the Pharaoh gave in. Moses began to lead the Hebrews out of Egypt, but the Pharaoh soon changed his mind. The Egyptian army chased the Hebrews and nearly caught up with them at the edge of the Red Sea. Calmly, Moses raised his staff, walking stick, and the water of the sea parted. The Hebrews crossed safely to the other side, and when the Egyptians tried to follow, the waters flooded over the army, drowning the soldiers, and the Hebrews escaped. The Torah calls the flight from Egypt the Exodus, which means departure, became a central event in the history of the Hebrew people. The 10 Commandments. After leaving Egypt, the Torah said the Hebrews wandered through a wilderness for 40 years. During this time, God gave Moses the laws that became the foundation of Judaism. These laws are called the 10 Commandments. Moses received the 10 Commandments on Mount Sinai, the mountain of God. Moses had gone up the mountain alone to pray, and when he returned, he was carrying 2 tablets of stone. Engraved on the tablets were the 10 Commandments. Some of the commandments spelled out the Hebrews' duties to God. For example, the first commandment was, "You shall have no other God before me." During their wanderings, some of the Hebrews had begun to worship other gods. This commandment reminded them of their promise to worship only one God. Another commandment told them to set aside 1 day a week, the Sabbath, for prayer and worship. Other commandments laid down basic moral laws. For example, one said, "You shall honor your father and mother." Other commandments forbid stealing, lying, and murdering. The 10 Commandments state Judaism's basic laws. By obeying the commandments, Hebrews would fulfill their part of the covenant with God. The responsibility was to make God's moral laws known to the world. In turn, God would protect them. Moses made several key contributions in the development of Judaism. First, he led the Jews out of Egypt. Jews have celebrated this event ever since as proof that God would watch over them. Second, Moses gave Judaism its fundamental laws, the 10 Commandments. Third, he forged the Hebrews into a united people devoted to a single God. The lives of David and Solomon, kings of Israel. After the wanderings of the wilderness, the Hebrews settled one more time in Canaan. The Jewish Bible tells how they built a strong kingdom and a great temple under 2 kings, David and Solomon. David founds the kingdom of Israel. In David's time, about 1000 BCE, the Hebrews were at war with a rival tribe, the Philistines. According to the Torah, the Philistines promised to be the Hebrews' slaves if someone could beat their fiercest warrior, the giant Goliath. David was not yet a grown man, but he was outraged at Goliath's mockery of the Hebrew God. Bravely he stepped forward, and his only weapon was a slingshot, and with one mighty throw, he felled Goliath with a stone. David's courage and faith were rewarded later when God made him king. According to the Torah, God said the Hebrew kingdom shall remain with him and with his children and his children's children forever. As king, David completed the defeat of the Philistines as well as other enemies. He united the 2 parts of Hebrews' land, Israel and Judah, into a single kingdom known as Israel. He created a strong central government. He gave the new kingdom its own army, courts, and government offices. David himself served as the nation's chief priest. David chose the city of Jerusalem for his capital. Under David, Jerusalem became the center of Israel's political and religious life. David brought the Hebrews' most sacred object, the Ark of Covenant, to Jerusalem. The ark was a wooden and gold chest that held the 10 Commandments. As the home of the ark, Jerusalem became a holy city. Solomon builds the great temple of Jerusalem. After David's death, his son Solomon became king. King Solomon decided to build a temple in Jerusalem to house the Ark of the Covenant. Solomon made the temple to be magnificent. According to the Torah, he told God, "Thus all people of earth will know your name." Building the temple was a huge undertaking and cost the Hebrews greatly. Solomon forced his people to work on the construction of the temple. More than 3,000 officials were needed to oversee the project, and Solomon taxed his people heavily to buy gold, cedar, wood, copper, and other materials. Solomon's methods angered many Hebrews. Near his death, their resentment exploded. In 931 BCE, the northern tribes broke away and became a separate kingdom of Israel. David and Solomon's descendants ruled the southern part of Judah. David and Solomon made important contributions in Judaism. They laid the foundation for the Jewish people to be governed by the kings more than 400 years. David established Jerusalem as a holy city, and Solomon built the first great temple of Jerusalem. After David and Solomon, Jerusalem would always be a holy city to the Jews and a powerful symbol of their faith. In this chapter, you read about the ancient Hebrews and the origins of Judaism. Through the stories of Abraham, Moses, David, and Solomon, you learn how Judaism developed